I basically cover two topics. One is our approach to measure state capture in procurement. So it's narrower than the CSD approach, but there is an overlap. So I think it's super nice for a discussion. And then we have a more recent research project and also an advocacy aspect to it, funded by OSI, where we apply our methods to defense procurement in the EU. And I will have a very quick glance at this. This is a 2-year project closing in the next few months. So to read just a few ideas about the extent and types of state capture in EU defense procurement, and looking at the EU directive of 2009 on defense procurement and looking at the impact of that so that we have a sense of what policies could work against state capture, what tools the EU have. So measuring state capture in public procurement, for us, state capture definition comes from corruption, but then it is more than just a lot of corruption. So let me first introduce the concept of corruption, then introduce the concept of state capture. Those of you who have seen me presenting, this is always what I bring up. So we need two conditions to be fulfilled to be able to talk about corruption. One is there needs to be a deliberate limitation or avoiding competition, right? Unjustified sole sourcing and direct contract awards. But that's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. We also need this limited competition to be used to favor a certain connected bidder and disfavor to the detriment of other non-connected bidders, right? So these are the two conditions, and it's very nice and neat because it feeds into institutional economics, political science theories on corruption. It also very nicely resonates with this World Bank and other policy documents. It doesn't fully overlap with criminal law concepts in many countries, but it's still reasonably close. Now, how do we get from corruption to state capture? And that's a schematic figure. So for us, we talk about state capture when corruption is systemic. So that's the overlap with the CSV definition. But we go one step further and we define what we mean by systemic. By systemic, we mean highly clustered in a network. So systemic can be that the whole country is fully captured, that's the bottom right. But it can also be that the subsection, like, defense is captured, but healthcare is not, right? So for that granularity, to see sectors, parts of the country, geographic or institutional, to see that those parts captured, we need this more detailed definition, clustering of corrupt relationships. And clustering of corrupt relationships means that for the actors in the captor network, all their relationships are high risk, all their relationships are corrupt. So the rule of the game for them is corruption and corruption only. Okay, so let me talk you through the details of this theoretical concept. So top left is a corruption-free state. You have the issuers or buyers on the top circles, suppliers or vendors, the green circles. The arrows between them are the contracts, and if it's dashed, it's clean. If it's continuous, then it's corrupt. So we have two clusters of contracting relationships. You could think of them as two regions or two sectors. And the point is that the relationships are clean. So we have a corruption-free state. Now we move on a corruption situation without state capture, top right. We have again the two clusters, the buyers and the suppliers. But some relationships are randomly corrupt, some are not. In this situation, probably the controls are not working fine. There is some bribery going on, or friendship, or family ties. But not every relationship in the different clusters are driven by corruption. So that's corruption, a lot of corruption, about half, but then no state capture. Then we move on to number 3, bottom left. We again have the two clusters, but the corrupt relationships are restricted only to one of the clusters, and they are not present in the other cluster. So it's a partially captured appropriated state, right? So there is one cluster of contracting entities, say that's healthcare, where all relationships are corrupt and high risk. So that sector is captured. But the other part of the state, say education procurement, that's only clean contract, so that's not captured. And then we have the bottom right, where every single relationship is highly corrupt. So all clusters are driven by corrupt relationships. So we have a fully captured state. Okay, so we have the corruption definition, which is transactional between two actors, and we have state capture definition, which is relational, and it's driven by the idea of there are clusters of contracting relationships, so groups of actors which regularly contract with each other, but much less with others, and these clusters are the main target for capture. And if the dominant rule within these relationships is corruption, we talk about a captured state because corruption is clustered. And if there is a mixed rule, then it's some corruption, but not full capture. So if you turn this theory into actual data, this is how it looks. This is from one fairly old paper published a few years ago. This is looking at Hungary's corruption network. And the larger these dots are, the higher their corruption risk index. The dots can represent buyers or suppliers, so these are organizations. And the relationships between them are the contracts between them. And the coloring is the clustering, so that's the action here. That's where you move from corruption to state capture. So you have, for example, the bottom kind of dark brown khaki colored cluster, right? Those are all very large dots, and they all seem to have very strong relationships with each other. They're close to each other. The network of relationships is very dense. So that's a captured part of the Hungarian state, because the actors tend to contract with each other, tend to have fewer contracts with others, never fully disconnected, but much fewer in relative terms. And then these relationships between them tend to be of very high risk, right? So the classic captured portion of the Hungarian state. And of course, this is big data, so you can look at whether it's a region, whether it's a sector, or centered on a particular ministry or what have you, right? So that's the idea of state capture and how we move from corruption using network tools to understand and define and precisely find the contours of state capture. So after this conceptual introduction, let me introduce you to the state capture in defense procurement project, and that's, I will jump over quite a few slides to save time. So we have a small number of contracts, and those contracts are those defense contracts are clustered or focused on a small number of countries: Poland, France, Germany, the UK, Romania, and Italy. This is partially driven by data quality like Poland, but also driven by large spenders like France, the UK, and Germany. In this project, we also looked at the gap between TED data and defense contracts in TED and the total spending according to Eurostat. And we also did a thorough manual mapping of defense contracts from media, from freedom of information requests, what have you. And we try to track additional contracts and try to track their contract values and compare those to the official estimate of Eurostat. The results are terrible, right? I mean, we have, well, I could say the tip of the iceberg, but maybe it's the bottom, right? A small portion of total spending, so that's 822 billion euros, and TED covers 6% of that, manual covers 12% of that. So overall, we have almost 20% of total spending in our data set. So that's, 1/5. That's quite disappointing, but in the end, defense is an extreme case. There's a lot of secrecy here. But also, if you look at OECD government, the glance figures, that data covers between 30 to 40% of procurement spending, according to budget statistics. So the red flags we are using, this is the the ones which is a short list, but these are the ones which we think are most comparable across European countries. So we have single bidding contract on competitive markets. So we already narrowed this down. Call for tenders not published in officer journal that limits open competition. Procedure type being open or not. So whether it's everyone can bid or only a small number of potential vendors are invited. Length of advertisement period, is it less than the mandatory minimum of 30 or 40 days? Some weights are assigned to non-price, non-quantitative evaluation criteria, and finally the number of days for making decisions with very short and as well as very long decision periods being of high risk. Okay, there is some validity test. I'm not going to talk you through this. We thoroughly validate these indicators and parameterize them. So really, we are not driven by our expert assessment, but rather data and relationships in the data to validate these indicators and select them for analysis. Okay, so the first question is how specific data we are looking at. Is defense so different from the rest of the country? And you could see that in most European countries, defense doesn't seem to be that much more higher risk than the rest of the procurement market, which is a surprising finding. But there are some exceptions, right? Like Italy is massively high up. I can only tell you that procurement in defense in Italy is more of a joke than real procurement, because Italy owns the largest defense suppliers. The Italian state is a majority owner, so it's not really procurement between a public buyer and a private bidder or supplier, but really the state is on both sides. So talking about open competition is a bit of a nonsensical concept in Italy's case. Still, it's an interesting benchmark for the rest of the countries. So this is how Italy's network of defense procurement looks like, with the orange dots being the main buyers and the black dots being the main suppliers. And then we highlighted the relationships as red. Those are the higher than average CRI score relationships, and the green ones, blue ones, sorry, those are the lower than average, so less corrupt relationships. You can already see that there is a cluster of clean or lower risk contracts, right? Very dense blue ties on the top right largely, and you have a core with mainly driven by red relationships and relatively few ties to outside of that network. So that's very interesting how Italy's defense procurement by the average risk is very high, actually is falling into two halves. One is relatively high, one is of relatively low contracting risk. Okay, so turning network metrics into something which is much easier to grasp is clustering of normalized CRIs, which is represented by these graphs for each country. Simply put, these bars tell you our degree of confidence in a single contract's corruption risk, knowing the neighboring contracts' corruption risks. So if this number is high, basically means, oh, if your neighbors are corrupt, you are also very corrupt. If this number is very low, it means, well, knowing your neighbor's corruption risk doesn't help me guessing your corruption risk. And why this translates into state capture is that if the bars are high, like France, Germany, UK, and Italy, corruption risks are very highly clustered. In France especially, if I know your neighbor's corruption risk, I'm very confident in knowing your corruption risk. So it's very, very high clustering, very high match of corruption levels between neighboring entities and neighboring countries. That's, those of you who know France, that's hardly surprising. Yeah, I didn't know French defense much, so I was very surprised by these results. But Germany and UK are there as well, so need not worry there. The big countries follow each other in this. Okay, so looking at
Mihaly, just a question.
Yeah.
Just a question. What does it mean, neighbors here?
Neighbor in the network. in the network, right? You contract with A, contracts with B, A also contracts with C. Knowing what's the risk of C helps me guess the risk of A. Yeah?
Michi, please consider if it's possible to finish, let's say, in few minutes.
No, I have half a minute. No, 2 slides.
Okay, you have.
Okay, EU directive on defense procurement, which mandated greater use of open competition and transparency using the TED portal. Interestingly, the countries implement different times, so it's super nice for research. Largely a transparency intervention. First, it works like hell. We have about 3% of contracts linked to the directive before the bulk of the countries introduce it. That jumps not 3%, 0.03%. That jumps up to 0.35 and then 0.64. So roughly 0.5% of that contracts are related to the directive after it's implemented. So a huge increase in transparency. And very nice, that's my last slide. We track the number of outcome variables before and after for each country. Single bidding went down from 39% to 21%. The average corruption risk score went down. No call for tender publication also went down. But interestingly, non-open procedures have been used more extensively. So it seems the more stringent regulation and transparency increased total publication, improved some outcomes, but also member states felt they need to rely on non-open procedures a lot more. So even though formally, they advertise, formally it's in TED, they actually use direct awards or invitation tenders. So the picture is not fully, bright and great. Some positive effects, some evasive action, and actually that's often what we see with anti-corruption reforms. It has some effect on the target behavior, but then there is an evasive strategic response which cancels out at least some of the positive effects. Okay, thanks a lot, and sorry for overrunning my